The call came in at 02:47, and Nurse Avery Langton had just finished her third cup of cold coffee when the ceiling shook. Not rattled, shook. The way a building only shakes when something enormous descends directly above it. The fluorescent light above bed 6 flickered. The crash cart rolled 2 inches to the left without anyone touching it. And then the intercom, the one nobody ever used because it had a broken squelch, crackled to life with a voice that did not belong to anyone on staff. Ground floor, this is RCAF Tactical. We are bringing in 3 critical. 1 GSW, 2 blast trauma, ETA 40 seconds. We need medic shadow. Repeat, we are requesting medic shadow. The charge nurse, a man named Delvecchio who had run the overnighter at Trillium Regional for 11 years and had never once looked rattled, stood very still next to the nursing station. He looked at the intercom, he looked at the ceiling. He looked at the intercom again. Medic shadow, he repeated, to no one. Nobody answered him. Down the hall, past the supply room with the broken cartwheel that nobody had fixed since February, Avery Langton set down her clipboard and closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she took off her lanyard, laid it on the shelf between the IV bags and the compression wraps, and walked toward the trauma bay. She had been at Trillium for 7 months. She had been introduced to the day shift as a supply and intake nurse, which was the hospital's careful way of saying she had been hired to do the work nobody wanted. Restocking, intake paperwork. Pre-op prep for the elective surgeries that ran on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She had a small locker in the east corridor, a parking pass that put her car 3 further from the entrance than any of the doctors, and a reputation, if you could call it that, for being quiet. Not shy, quiet. There is a difference, and the nurses who had been at Trillium long enough recognized it. But nobody asked. Dr. Hadley, who ran the ER on the overnight rotation and had strong opinions about departmental hierarchy, had told her during her second week that he appreciated staff who understood their lane. She had looked at him for a moment, long enough that he shifted his weight, and then she had said, "Understood," and gone back to the supply cart. She understood her lane. She had understood her lane in Kandahar when her forward operating unit's medevac went down in a brownout, and she performed a needle thoracostomy on a sergeant with a tension pneumothorax using a 14-gauge catheter and the light from someone's phone. She had understood her lane in Valcartier when the base medical officer was unreachable and a private with a femoral bleed had about 4 minutes, and she had used every one of them. She had understood her lane for 9 years in the Canadian Armed Forces and 2 deployments to regions that didn't appear on the briefing maps that got shown to the public. She left the forces at 32. She did not explain why to anyone at Trillium. She listed her military service on her application, which had gone to the hiring committee, which had passed it to HR, which had filed it in a folder that apparently nobody had since opened. What they knew was that she had her RN, her trauma cert, and a letter of reference from a colonel whose name meant nothing to anyone in a civilian hospital. What they did not know was what the soldiers who had served with her called her when the radio went quiet and the situation went bad. They called her Shadow, because she moved like she wasn't there until suddenly she was the only thing keeping someone alive. The 3 men came through the bay doors before the automatic sensors had time to register them. The first 2 were conscious. The third was not. Behind them, 2 RCAF flight medics in full kit, helmets still on, faces still reading the kind of focus that doesn't come from training simulations. Delvecchio moved to intercept them. He was good at his job, and he knew protocol, and he put himself exactly where the team leader needed to go. "Sir, you need to check in through, where is Medic Shadow? I'm going to need you to." Our commanding officer said this hospital. He said, "Ask for Shadow." He said, "She's here. Where is she?" It wasn't a question by the end of it. The flight medic, name tape read Greer, had the kind of voice that had been trained to carry over rotor noise, and it carried very well through an empty ear corridor at 02:51 in the morning. Delvecchio opened his mouth. Avery Langton said from behind him, "I'm here." Greer turned. His eyes went to her ID badge, which said Langton A, Supply and Intake. He looked at her face. "Avery Langton," he said. "Sergeant First Class, 2 Field Ambulance, former," she said. "What do we have?" He told her in 11 words. She was already moving before he finished the 7th. Dr. Hadley arrived at 03:04. He had been in the physician's lounge when his pager went off, and he'd taken the stairs because the elevator on the east wing was slow. And that was a decision that gave him 60 extra seconds of walking, 60 seconds during which Avery Langton had already made 3 calls that stabilized the man who, according to Greer's initial handoff, had been given a field assessment of non-survivable at the point of injury. Hadley pushed through the trauma bay doors and stopped. She was at the head of the gurney. She had intubated him, the correct blade, the correct depth, confirmed with bilateral chest rise, and a capnography reading she had interpreted without waiting to be told. There was a second IV line she had placed in a position he did not recognize from any civilian training protocol, but which was clearly working, because the man's blood pressure was no longer the number Greer had given at the door. One of the RCAF flight medics was working alongside her, not directing her, alongside her, in the way that people work alongside someone they already know. Who authorized? Hadley started. I need a surgeon, Avery said. She did not look up. He's got a splenic lac that I can feel from here, and his pressure's only holding because I've pushed fluids he doesn't really have room for. He needs an oar in the next 15 minutes. You are a supply nurse, Hadley said. I need a surgeon, she said again. Same voice, same lack of inflection. This is not your patient. This is not your Dr. Hadley. Greer moved between them. He had taken his helmet off. He was looking at Hadley with a specific expression of someone who had very recently been in a situation where people died from wasted seconds. We came here asking for her by name. Our medical officer served with her in Helmand Province in 2019. He told us that if any one of our guys was going to make it, we needed Shadow. So you can have the conversation about her lane after you call the surgeon, sir. The sir landed in the room like a stone. Del Vecchio, who had been watching from the doorway, picked up the surgical team line and dialed. There is a kind of silence that only happens in hospitals after something has either gone very wrong or very right. It settles into the hallways the same way regardless. It has the same weight. The only difference is what people do with their hands. At 04:30, the surgeon, Dr. Marchand, whom Avery had called and who had arrived pulling a scrub cap over her hair, came out of the oar and nodded once, stable. Unexpected given what she'd been told walking in, but stable. Avery was sitting on a bench in the east corridor, the same corridor where her locker was. She had her hands in her lap and she was looking at the floor, not because she was upset, but because the overhead light was too bright, and she had developed a habit, years ago, of finding fixed points at eye level or below when she needed to come down from something. Greer sat down next to her. He didn't say anything for a while. That was something she had always respected about the people who actually came from the field. They understood that not everything needed to be filled with words. He's been looking for you, Greer finally said. Bouchard. She knew who Bouchard was. Captain Henri Bouchard, 3PPCLI, the man she had kept alive in a drainage ditch outside a village, whose name she had been instructed not to record in any document. He had a wife, he had 2 daughters. He had a way of whistling while he cleaned his kit that drove everyone in the unit quietly insane, and she had been grateful for it every single time. I heard he re-upped, she said. He did. He's the one who told us. Said if we ever went down in southern Ontario and it was bad, find the hospital near Brampton and ask for Shadow. Greer paused. He said you were the reason he made it home. She didn't say anything. Did you know? Greer said after a moment. That there's a supply cart outside this ER that has a broken wheel? Has a work order on it dated 4 months ago. She almost smiled. February, that seem right to you? Person who put that cart where it is. She looked at the floor. It seems survivable, she said. He nodded slowly. He's going to want to know you're okay. Bouchard, I'm okay. Are you? She thought about that the way she thought about most things, carefully and without rushing to the answer that would end the conversation fastest. The truth was something she had spent 7 months adjusting to, and adjusting was not the same as arriving. She had come back from the service with a body that worked and a mind that had learned to route around certain roads. The nursing degree had given her something to hold on to when the structure of the forces was no longer there. She had taken the job at Trillium because it was quiet, and because quiet was what she needed, and because she had told herself that she was done being the person who got called when everything else had failed. Turns out that is not the kind of thing you get to decide. I'm working on it, she said. Greer looked at her the way the people from that life always looked at her, not with pity, which she would have walked away from, but with recognition. Like they were reading a map they also had folded in their pocket. He wants to visit, Greer said. Bouchard, when he's rotated out. If that's okay. She thought about the locker in the east corridor, the parking spot 3 rows back, the supply cart with the broken wheel, and the work order from February. Yeah, she said. That's okay. Del Vecchio found her at 05:15 when the shift was thinning and the sky outside was doing the thing it does in southern Ontario in early spring, going from black to dark blue to the particular gray that means the sun is deciding. He handed her a coffee, a fresh one. You should have told us, he said. He didn't say it accusatorially. He said it the way people say things when they're trying to understand something and haven't found the right frame yet. Told you what? She said. What you are. She looked at the coffee. I told you everything on my application. You listed your service. I did. You didn't tell anyone what it meant. She didn't answer that right away. The thing was she had learned, and this was not bitterness, it was simply observation, that most places don't actually want to know. They want the credential and the compliance and the ability to fill a shift on a Tuesday when someone calls in sick. They want the form filled out. They do not want the thing behind the form, because the thing behind the form is harder to manage and easier to misunderstand. She had been a combat medic. She had been a tactical trauma responder. She had been, in the language the forces used for paperwork, a highly specialized pre-hospital care provider with field surgical adjunct training. What that meant in practice was that she had kept people alive in conditions where the textbook had already run out of pages, using what she had, and the knowledge that stopping was not an option. She had put that on the form. She had used the correct terminology. She had listed the certifications, the deployments, the commendations, in the order they had occurred. And she had been hired to restock supply carts, which she had done, because she needed the job and because she had needed the quiet and because she had understood genuinely that a civilian hospital had its own architecture and you did not walk into someone else's structure and immediately start rearranging the walls. But she had also, and this she had not said to anyone, known, in the way you know things when you've spent enough time in situations where reading the room correctly is the difference between someone living and someone not. She had known that the day would come when the room would be impossible to read wrong, when the training would be the only thing in the room that mattered. She had waited, she had been patient, she had restocked the supply cart, she had been right. My application said everything it needed to say, she said to Del Vecchio. Someone would have had to read it. He was quiet for a moment. He was a decent man, she had decided early, one of the ones who ran a department fairly and treated his staff like adults and did not take credit for things he hadn't done. His silence now was not defensive. It was the silence of someone sitting with something they had gotten wrong. The broken cart, he said. February, I'll get it fixed today. She looked at him. I know you will. Hadley came to find her at the end of the shift. She was at her locker, changing back into her jacket, the one she wore on the walk to the parking lot 3 rows back. He stood in the corridor doorway, and he had the look of a man who had spent the last 2 hours revising a speech. She saved him from it. I don't need an apology, she said. He looked surprised. People always expected her to want the apology. She had stopped needing them somewhere around her second deployment, when she had understood that the energy required to receive an apology gracefully was better spent elsewhere. I was wrong, he said, in how I know, she said, and you know. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. That man wouldn't have made it. He might have. No. He said it without ego, which surprised her. No. Not with what was happening when you stepped in. I would have lost him. He paused. I would like to know what you know. If that's something you'd be willing to. Yes, she said. He blinked. I've been here 7 months, she said. I've been waiting for someone to ask. She pulled her jacket on. You can start by reading my file. Outside, the parking lot was cold the way parking lots in Ontario are cold in spring. Not the deep cold of winter, which at least has the decency to feel intentional, but the sideways cold of a season that hasn't decided yet. She walked to her car with her hands in her pockets. Her phone buzzed, unknown number, but the area code was one she recognized. She stood next to her car for a moment, the keys in her hand, the sky going slowly, incrementally lighter. Then she answered. Langton, she said. The voice on the other end was tired and warm and unmistakably the voice of a man who whistled while he cleaned his kit and drove everyone quietly insane. Shadow, said Bouchard. I heard you had a long night. She leaned against the car. She looked at the sky, which was doing its best. I've had longer, she said. You doing okay? She thought about the gurney, the intubation, the blood pressure climbing back to something that meant a man would go home to someone. She thought about the bench in the east corridor and the broken supply cart and a parking spot 3 rows further than it needed to be. She thought about her file sitting in Hadley's hands right now, full of everything she had ever been asked to leave unread. There, she said. On the other end, Bouchard exhaled. Slow and long, the way people breathe when something they've been carrying gets a little lighter. Yeah, he said. Me too, the sky kept going. She stayed where she was and let it.